Welcome, everyone. My name is Miyoko Chu. I'm the Senior Director of Communications here at the lab. And I want to thank you for joining us, whether you are in the room with us tonight or joining us from locations around the world through our live stream. There's a camera in the back, and we're joined by many people outside of this room as well. I wanted to give a special thanks to all of you who are lab members or supporters. It's your support that makes this seminar series possible, as well as all the lab's work in science education and conservation. So thank you. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to give you a heads up about next week's seminar, which will be hosted by the Cayuga Bird Club. So the club meets here next Monday at 7:30, and first they do club business, and then it's followed by the talk, which will be by Kevin McGowan, an ornithologist here at the lab, and the instructor of the lab's home study course in bird biology and our various tutorials and webinars. Kevin is going to give a talk about waterfowl ID, the most important things. That talk is not going to be live streamed. Is that correct, Mark? We don't think it's going to be live streamed, but if this topic interests you and you can't attend in person, you can consider taking his live webinar on that topic. And so if you're interested, there's information on our website at birds.cornell.edu/courses. One last announcement. I know it doesn't look like spring out there yet, but believe it or not, this month our spring field ornithology course begins on March 26th, an 8-week-long course. You can take field trips, lectures, and or overnight trips. So if you're interested, there are some flyers on the podium and registration forms. Even if you're not interested, if you don't mind taking a flyer and posting it somewhere so others might see it, we would really appreciate your help in spreading the word. Those of you who are online, if you want to check it out at birds.cornell.edu/SFO. And so now I'm really happy to welcome Rachel Dickinson tonight. She is a lifelong resident of our neighboring village of Freeville, and she decided to expand her world about a decade ago by traveling, and then she began writing about her travels. Today she's an award-winning travel writer, and her pieces have been published in magazines and websites ranging from The Atlantic and Smithsonian.com to Farm Life and Salon. In her book, Falconer on the Edge, A Man, His Birds, and the Vanishing Landscape of the American West, she follows hardcore falconer Steve Shingren through a hunting season in Wyoming. And our Wild Birds Unlimited store here has copies of that book. If you'd like to purchase one, Rachel will be happy to stay and sign books after her talk. So her talk tonight is titled, Have Notebook and Camera, We'll Travel. Confessions of a Travel Writer Who Birds to Travel and Travels to Bird. So thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Miyoko. Oh, what a lovely turnout for such a frigid night. I applaud you all for coming. There's going to be about a 12 or 15 minute introduction to my journey into the world of travel writing. I'm going to have a slideshow of images running behind me that aren't timed to my talk. So if you space out a little and just want to watch the pretty pictures, that's fine. They're pictures from Tibet and Peru, Alaska, Italy, and various places, even some local places. And they're just to give you some kind of flavor of the trips I've been on. And at one point, there's even a photo of George Clooney's house in Lake Como, Italy. So look for the wisteria. That's the hint. At the end of the talk, I'll be happy to answer questions. After I read the introduction, I'm going to read 2 pieces. And don't worry, they're not very long, but they will incorporate birds into travel writing. So. Here we go. I decided to try my hand at writing about 15 years ago. My work career to date had proven what a dilettante I really was, jumping around from job to job, landing at interesting places, then finding myself looking around and tapping my foot about a year or two into my tenure. So what the heck, I thought. Someone's got to fill all those pages in magazines and, at that time, newspapers. And in some ways, being so naive as to think I could somehow be worthy of some ink space helped me. Like most aspiring writers, I thought my words and ideas were golden. I thought that any editor who read my little thought-provoking essays, which I assumed were oh so clever, would say, sign her up. Thought that getting a writing gig was as easy as waltzing into the editor's office and saying, I want to write a column for you. My naivete and ignorance allowed me to do that very thing. And after the editor at the Ithaca Journal stopped laughing, he asked me what I would write about. I pulled a little piece of paper from my pocket where I had written 10 ideas down. Ideas like sweet corn and walking, and said, this is what I'd write about. Then when he stopped laughing again, I explained that he might want to sell more papers in my part of the county, and if I could write about recognizable places and common experiences, people would want to buy the paper. In the end, it was the economic argument that sold him on the idea. I went on to write a weekly column for the Ithaca Journal for about 5 years, and I managed to get a faithful little following. The paper eventually saw a spike in readership on the days my column ran, although that was also the day they inserted coupons. But I like to think that ultimately the column was a win-win, both for the paper and for me. In that column, I wrote about myself, my family, and my little corner of the county. People would often ask how my family felt about being fodder for the column, and I told them that this way my kids would have a clipping file to take to their psychotherapist. That might help save them some time and money in the end. Everything was fair game for the story, from my daughter failing her driver's test to my husband's travel through the South in search of the ivory-billed woodpecker, to my account of seeing a mountain lion on the edge of Freeville while on my morning walk. During the 5 years I wrote the column, I learned how to write a nice little 500-word essay, and I also figured out that I wanted to earn more than $37.50 for a piece of writing. Somehow I found out about a travel writing conference that was taking place at an inn in the Hudson Valley called Troutbeck. Because I didn't have the required travel writing clips, I talked my way into the conference. I later figured out that the conference organizer had a cancellation at the last moment, so there was an open slot, and because she didn't want to lose the money, she let me in. There were about 30 writers and 15 editors at the conference, and for 3 days we spent way too much time with each other. In one defining moment, in a desperate effort to distinguish myself from other writers, I said I wrote about birds and birding, and I walked away with assignments from Yankee Magazine, Islands Magazine, and a magazine called Elegant Weddings. Welcome to the wonderful world of travel writing. That first piece for Islands Magazine was about going to a tiny island of Iona in the Inner Hebrides for a week-long religious retreat. I stayed at the monastery in a room with 2 bunk beds. I walked in, looked at my 20-something-year-old roommates and said, I don't do top bunks. I then wandered back to the pier to greet the next group coming across from the Isle of Mull and saw 2 men, one with a clerical collar and both with binoculars hanging around their necks. The one with the collar was an Episcopal priest from South Africa, and the other was a big wig administrator for the Southern Baptists. And for the next week, the 3 of us ditched all but the necessary meetings and spent our time exploring that 3-mile-long island in search of the elusive corncrake. That, it turns out, is exactly the kind of story I was meant to write. I decided this was what I always wanted to do. I wanted to limp after the slightly off-center story and focus on human experiences in places other than Freeville, New York. And if I could add a birding twist, all the better. I traveled to Lhasa, Tibet, and was standing in the Potala Palace, a former monastery of the Dalai Lamas, the day before the first train pulled into the station on the new railroad from China, a train that was destined to bring thousands of immigrants to that remote city. I took what I came to think of as my drug cartel tour and visited Medellin, Bogota, and Cartagena in Colombia. I went to northern Peru and rode on a red bus that barreled along high mountain roads, where I learned to sit on the side of the bus that hugged the mountain, else I'd be looking down the face of a 1,000-foot cliff. I traveled to the Russian Far East and had walrus with impossibly long tusks swimming past my Zodiac in the frigid Bering Sea. I visited an upscale community in the Florida Panhandle, and my story was not about the beautiful houses you could rent, but rather how I spent the weekend on a bicycle searching for Karl Rove's house, all the while trying to figure out what I was going to say if I found him. I spent 3 weeks in Ireland driving around the country on the other side of the road, on roads that were no wider than my dining room table. I blogged about the trip for The Atlantic, and the stories were about where to stay in Ireland. Wasn't about where to stay in Ireland, but rather all the people you meet along the way. And as a gift from the gods, I was trapped there for an extra week, care of the invisible volcanic ash cloud from Iceland. You can't ask for a better story than that. I went to Alaska and at one point talked to a guy at a remote salmon fishery whose biggest problem at the moment was what to do about the humpback whale who had discovered the cove where he released the salmon fry and was eating up the profits. In all these places, I found birds and more birds, so I wrote about visiting towering seabird colonies in the Arctic, about climbing a hill at dawn and seeing the marvelous spatule-tail hummingbird in Peru, and about birding with the editor of a Catholic newspaper in Belfast, who was a keen birder and took me to a trash-strewn gully on the edge of town where we watched birds settle into the gorse while we talked politics. I carry a little digital camera and a couple of moleskin notebooks and several pens when I'm on the road, and all of that fits in one compartment of a small backpack. These, plus some imagination, willingness to talk to people, and being an observer that verges on the voyeur, are the tools of my trade. Gone are the days when you could travel with just a notebook and pen. If you want to be competitive in the travel writing business, today you have to be ready and willing to hand an editor not only a written story, but photos and possibly video. I'm not a photographer like some of you I see in this very room, but I can do a pretty good grab shot that can place a story in context. I began selling some of my photos along with the stories a couple years ago, and The Atlantic, Smithsonian, Men's Journal, and Huffington Post have run slideshows of my shots along with the text. Although this is neat and I love seeing my photos in print and on the web, it also means that in addition to finding and then writing this story, I have to be on the lookout for good photo and video opportunities. It's also good to be aware that sometimes the story is about getting to the story. Sometimes the journey itself is the story, as was the case when I rented a canal boat and took it along a section of the Erie Canal, or the time I took a night train from Montreal to the end of the Gaspé Peninsula and sat in the dark observation car huddled under a blanket and watched the sun rise over the St. Lawrence at 4:15 in the morning. And sometimes the story can be about taking your morning walk through the swamp along the old railroad tracks on the backside of your little village and watching the water rise and fall as spring turns to summer. You can watch the mergansers and geese pair up, sit on eggs, then help their young navigate perilous journeys through the dangers of the swamp. And you could wade through the snow that covers the railroad bed after the leaves have turned red and yellow and dropped from the trees, and the waterfowl have headed south, and the beavers have holed up in their neat and tidy lodge built not too far from the trail's edge. And you can realize that the big story might not be on a canal boat in Burgundy, or in the Dalai Lama's palace in Tibet, or on the drug cartel trail in Colombia, but rather the story can be just a few steps from your back door. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and go to some specific stories so you can see how to integrate photos and birds. So, little technical details here. Okay. I realize you just saw some of these slides, but you're going to see them again because we like them so much. All right, this is a piece called Where Birds Rule the Earth, and it ran in the Atlantic magazine and was accompanied by several of my photos. Once I figure out how to make this work. I've done it before. Here we go. The ship made its way toward the Russian port city. There we go, that's even better. The ship made its way toward the Russian port city of Provendinia, the water smooth as glass. On one side of the fjord, abandoned, low-slung gray apartment buildings almost blended in with the low hills. On the other side, someone had painted many of the occupied buildings in blazing colors, pink, yellow, and minty green, a jarring sight in the washed-out landscape. This is the part of Russia that Sarah Palin could see if she had super binocular powers. It lies just across the Bering Strait from Alaska. Russia's far eastern federal district is huge, 2.4 square miles, roughly twice the size of India, and it takes up 1/3 of the country, but only 6.7 million people populate that vast space. The district's biggest city is Vladivostok, best known for being the last stop on the Trans-Siberian Railroad and home to the Russian Pacific Fleet. Provendinia was once a thriving military town with a population as high as 10,000. Today, the population's about 2,000. Most of the ethnic Russians have left, ceding the city to the region's indigenous people. Now the government is struggling to stem the tide of people leaving the desolate Far East. It was precisely this lack of people that brought me here. I came to see the birds. Because there are few humans, fewer than 3 per square mile, the birds of the Russian Far East are, well, fairly unsuspicious. And although birders can see some of these Russian species in Alaska, in the Aleutians, or in a place like Gamble on St. Lawrence Island, a few dozen birders go there a year to see birds that have blown across the Bering Strait. When you walk across the tundra and come upon a little Asian songbird, you know that you're seeing it in the very same habitat where it has existed for thousands of years. The experience is exhilarating. We sailed south from Provendinia in the choppy waters of the Bering Sea toward the Kamchatka Peninsula, intent on looking for birds along the coast. Although it was mid-July, the air temperature was only in the 30s and the sea spray was joined by spitting wind. As the boat neared an island, birds began taking off, flying in circles near the cliffs. More and more birds lifted from the land, the ruckus they made growing into a din. Dainty black-legged kittiwakes and glaucous gulls flew in swirling clouds overhead, while black and white thick-billed and common murres skimmed low across the water, looking like tuxedo-clad squadrons on maneuvers. Thousands of murres stood on narrow ledges, faces to the wall, each protecting its one egg. Occasionally we'd spy small groups of horned puffins near their nests on cliffs, or a tufted puffin with its clown-like face and long feathers swept back in a coif, as if the bird were a vain maestro. Suddenly, one of the glaucous gulls, a huge white and gray predatory bird, snatched a young murre from a ledge, swallowing it whole. In the commotion, the egg of another murre fell and smashed on the rocks below. Murres lay one egg every summer. If something happens to that egg or that chick, the chances of laying another egg the same year are slim. It's easy to delude yourself into thinking you're completely alone with nature in the wild Bering Sea. But every so often, around a bend, a ghostly, abandoned Soviet-era building rises from the cliffs. We passed a weather station high on a hillside and a derelict fox farm with its concrete barn and rows of collapsing cages that were used to hold the animals raised for their fur. One foggy morning we went ashore. On the beach, ravens were picking at the carcass of a young gray whale. Huge ribs and jawbones were scattered everywhere. As we walked on the tundra beyond the beach, I almost fell into a small circular hole and then realized I was surrounded by low, hummock-like food storage shelters made of whale ribs covered with sod. We had come across a hunting camp where Yupiks had been butchering their massive catch for years. A distant, loud cack-cack-cack sound broke the quiet. As we strained to see through the heavy mist, a large bird, a sandhill crane, dropped over the top of a hill and glided in, long legs trailing, to land at the edge of a small lake in front of us. The crane cried again, cack-cack-cack. An answer came from across the water. Calling back and forth, the gray beauties flew toward each other, meeting above the water, then turning and flying in tandem over a nearby hill. It began to rain, and as we slogged back toward the boat, at my feet were dainty, miniaturized dogwoods, rhododendrons, and azaleas growing in the spongy sod. I thought about the cranes and their balletic flight, and the ravens pecking away at the whale carcass, and how the beauty of the desolation of the Russian Far East converges in this spot on the tundra at the edge of the frigid Bering Sea. Now here's another piece that is about birding in the Falkland Islands. This is a trip I took to Bleecker Island, which is one of the smaller islands in the Falklands, but it has a settlement, and there a settlement means maybe a house or two. So you learn to kind of readjust your ideas about how people live. So this is called Birding in the Falklands. I bird to travel, and I travel to bird. It works both ways. Although I'm not what I would call a keen birder, I am observant and can usually figure out which end of the binoculars to look through. I do love looking at birds and noting their colors and markings and watching their behavior. On a trip to the Falkland Islands in 2012, this bird love was put to a test. The Falklands, a British overseas territory, is a windswept archipelago set 300 miles off the coast of Argentina in the frigid waters of the South Atlantic. Next stop, South Georgia Island, where Shackleton ended his famous search for the South Pole. The Falklands is a you can't get there from here kind of place, and if you're traveling from North America, you have to take the weekly flight from Santiago, Chile. But that means you have a week to explore the islands once you're there. 3,000 people live in the Falklands, many of them descendants of Scottish sheep farmers and English sailors, along with about 1 million sheep and 10 million birds. But I'm making up those last numbers, but you get the drift. People travel from island to island by Figgis, the island air service, which flies planes that hold 8 to 10 people and lands on airstrips that are nothing more than grassy fields. If you're lucky, the pilot will let you sit in the co-pilot seat and you can chat as you fly over islands and mountains and rough seas. I read about the birds of the Falklands before traveling there and was really looking forward to seeing the black-browed albatross, 5 species of penguin, and flightless steamer ducks. On my first island hopping trip, I headed to Bleecker Island, which would get me at least 2 penguin species, the steamer duck, and maybe a black-necked swan. The owners of Bleecker, Mike and Phil Rendell, met me at the airstrip and drove me the length of the island, 3 miles, to the settlement, consisting of their home, 2 guest houses, and the house of a farm manager. There are no roads on Bleecker. There are no roads on most of Falklands Islands. So Mike headed overland, pointing out where the penguin colonies were and the freshwater pond. After I got settled, I put on my boots and rain jacket because, like Ithaca, weather in the Falklands is synonymous with changeable. I slung my binoculars around my neck, grabbed my camera, and headed out to find some birds. Have I mentioned the skuas? These are huge predatory birds that look like uber gulls. They are the bird bullies of the islands, harassing other birds to drop their food, attacking and devouring young birds, swooping and diving on anything they don't like, including people. I first met them on Fair Isle in the Outer Hebrides, where I was hit on the head from behind by a skua as I walked down a road. When you're hit, you see stars and you don't forget the incident. As I walked away from the settlement in Bleecker, I saw that there were skuas everywhere. As I walked, a group of sheep followed, taking note of what I'm sure they viewed as peculiar human behavior. I stayed along the fence line, figuring that the skuas might take me for a moving fence post. They eyed me as I walked past, and I know they were deciding whether or not I was worth harassing. I climbed through the fence and entered an area of amazing tussock grass, huge 6-foot-tall clumps of grass, and followed a little path toward the sea. I smelled and heard the rockhopper penguins before I saw them. These little penguins have yellow feathers sprouting from their head like exaggerated eyebrows, and when they walk, they waddle a couple of steps, then give a little hop. It was molting season, so some of them looked to be in a serious state of undress as they shed last year's feathers and were growing new ones. I headed back through the grass and through the fence. Did I mention the sheep? And toward the sandy beach where the gentoo penguins come in after a day of fishing. Walking on the close-cropped grass by both sheep and upland geese, I saw big patches of what looked like heather. You can see them in the photo here. It's called diddle-dee in the Falklands. This, I discovered, is where the skuas live, because when I stooped to look at the little pink flowers on the diddle-dee, one of those big brown birds came right at me. I ducked and then started to run, well, my version of running, you can imagine, toward the beach, feeling like I was channeling Suzanne Plachette in the schoolyard scene in The Birds. Gentoos are medium-sized penguins, and everything they do looks adorable. I sat panting on the beach from my skua-induced run and watched the penguins emerge from the blue-green surf, stand up, then do their waddling run toward shore with flippers akimbo. And they were curious about me, coming closer and closer as I sat still. The Caribbean-colored water, white sand, and the bright white and black of the penguins put me in a relaxed, trance-like state until I knew I had to walk back through skua land. I stuck to the beach for as long as I could. See, they're watching me. I searched for a piece of driftwood in an island group not known for trees. I saw what I thought was a piece of driftwood, but it turned out to be a slimy piece of kelp. Finally, I found a 3-foot piece of wood, what might have been a 2x4 100 years ago, and picked it up to use as my skua protection. I headed inland, spying plovers and dotterels in the grass on my way to the freshwater pond to look at the black-necked swans. I wandered off course and saw several skuas flying low, looking for something to harass, menace, or eat. Have I mentioned the sheep? I started running, waving the 2x4 above my head, yelling, "Get out of here, leave me alone!" 2 of them double-teamed me and came straight at me, hitting the stick. At that point, I lost all interest in birds, except for the ones that were trying to kill me. Soon, a striated caracara started following me as well. The faint 2-track road that ran down the middle of the island lay ahead, and I ran for it. The skuas got bored. They had me right where they wanted me, and they left. I held my driftwood high, ready for combat, knowing there would be a sneak attack from the rear. I passed the tussock grass and the rockhopper colony, spying a pretty little tussock wren at the edge of the grass as I hurried past. I looked out to the sea and saw thousands of imperial cormorants heading toward the island, bringing food to their young. They flew low over me, landing about 200 yards away on the crest of a small hill. There were tens of thousands of cormorants in the colony, many of them young birds just leaving the messy ground nests, and several dozen skuas were gliding low, hoping to nab a young bird or a bit of fish dropped by an adult. Page turn problem. Okay. I swung wide, hugging the fence line once again, and was thrilled when I saw the little settlement up ahead. As I walked between the Rendell's home and the guest house where I was staying, I stopped and knelt down to take a photo. 2 skua rose from the diddle-dee and hovered right in front of me, like they were curious. I dropped my camera and started waving my stick. They looked puzzled, then settled back down in the patch of diddle-dee, watching me as I ran to my guest house. Later, over a wonderful dinner of lamb, broccoli, new potatoes, apple crumble, and a bottle of Merlot, Phil and Mike told me that Elaine, one of the farm managers, feeds the 2 skua near the house, so they associate people with food. We talked long into the night as the sun set on Bleecker Island, replaced by inky blackness and a billion stars. We talked about people, politics, and birds, and more birds, and listened to the braying and fussing of the Magellanic penguins in the colony right behind their house. Thank you. Okay, it's question time, people. I'm ready. Yes?
Where's your next trip?
Oh, I anticipated that. Where is my next trip, is the question. Well, it's not that exotic. I'm in an MFA program right now at Goucher College for creative nonfiction, and I have to write a thesis. And unfortunately, it takes place in the middle of Indiana. So that is my next trip. More questions? Yes?
Our online viewers asked, how many bird species are on your life list and what is the most rewarding bird you've seen?
Okay, the question is how many bird species are on my life list and what is the most rewarding bird I've seen? I don't have a life list. I do have a bird guide book, several of them, and so I look everything up and I kind of remember what I've seen and where I've seen it. And the most amazing bird would probably have to be that marvelous spatule-tail hummingbird that I saw in northern Peru. It just looked completely unreal. And actually what was even more exciting than that was watching all the birders I was with watching the bird, because that to me became fascinating. Another question? Come on, people, you're disappointing me.
Well, I know everyone's wondering how you got in this position where all these people are sending you places for free, all these exotic locations we've always wanted to go. And,
Okay, the $1 million question, how do you get to do this and for free? And well, how do you get to be sent places like this? So when you start out as a travel writer, you do things on your own nickel and you get the experience and you write about your stories for local papers or regional papers. But as you start to move up the food chain, people start wanting the kind of writing that you do and the kind of experiences that you write about. And you get courted by both magazines and by tourist boards and PR companies, places like Ithaca Convention Visitor and Convention Bureaus. Those places will start to send me information about what their territory has to offer. I mean, there are PR companies that represent entire countries. And so like I'll get something from Denmark, and they'll say, here's what we have going. and we would like to introduce you to some of the things we have. And so that's how I get to go to a lot of places. But they don't do that for people who just want to go. They do that for people who actually have a track record in travel writing. And so when they say, would you like to come, say, to the Falklands? And they invite me knowing that I write for places like The Atlantic and Men's Journal and these other large publications where they know the ink space is worth a lot. Mari Reed.
Do they then vet your articles? Do they want you to write it a certain way? Suppose you were going to be negative people and you play that very much.
Okay, Mari Reed asked the question, do they then vet your articles? And what do they do if you're going to write about something negative? I never, ever, 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 ever let anyone read anything before it's published. It's just not done unless you want to check a quote with someone. And so these PR companies or tourist boards, some will try to push you on it, but it's just, you're already in gray territory. You don't want to make it worse. And so they know, I just say to them, here's a list of everything I've written. If you like it, great, we can work from there. But no, they don't see anything I write until it's published. Yes?
Are there any trees in the Falklands, or have the sheep eaten them all?
Are there any trees in the Falklands, or have the sheep eaten them all? There are very, very few trees. I went to one island, Carcass Island, and I was staying at a little place there. And they had like a little hedgerow of what looked like cedar trees, and it was so astounding that I remembered it. So, not many. Other questions? Yes?
How do you research the birds and prepare for what birds you might see before you head out on a
Okay.
trip?
How do I research the birds and prepare for the birds I might see before heading out on a trip? Well, there are guidebooks to birds pretty much anywhere you want to go. So, for example, before I went to the Falklands, I actually had to send away for a guidebook to the birds of the Falkland Islands, and I think I had to send to the Falklands for it. It's not widely distributed. But I did end up making an acquaintance online. I tried to figure out who was the top birder in the Falklands. So I looked for, there are 2 birders in the Falklands. So I hooked up with one of them, and he is awesome. His name is Alan Henry. And so we had this, long back and forth correspondence. And when I finally got there, I spent a day with Alan, whose day job is as a customs agent. So he goes and he climbs up the sides of those really tall ships that come into the harbor and make sure everyone's paying their taxes. But he is this total bird nut, and he will go anywhere in any kind of weather. And he just took me, at one point, he took me across this island, Kidney Island, that has no people on it. It's nothing but tussock grass and elephant seals. So he said to me as we're heading up through this tussock grass, and you can't imagine this stuff. It's way over your head. The root ball comes up to your knees, and you're trying to squeeze your feet in between these root balls. I just kept thinking, ankle breaker, ankle breaker. I know it's going to happen. And so I'm trying to follow this guy, Henry. And he said, okay, now we might disturb an elephant seal, and if you hear something rushing towards you, stand absolutely still. It's not your instinct, but stand still. Well, at one point, we heard something rushing toward us, and I grabbed him around the waist and screamed. So, and the elephant seal went right past us. So, but we made our way across this island. I don't know how he knew where we were going, but we ended up right at a rockhopper colony that also had the one example of a macaroni penguin that there was in the Falklands that he knew of. So we sat there and looked at it, and then we saw a hybrid one, a rockhopper macaroni penguin, and we sat and looked at that, and then we had to make our way back. So that's the kind of research I do. I find people who know what they're doing. More questions? I'm here all night. Mr. Germ,
Rachel, you've taken some incredible trips, but is there another kind of dream trip that is out there waiting for you?
well, I have discussed, the question is, I've taken some marvelous trips, but is there a dream trip out there that's waiting for me? What I've discovered about myself is that if it's above 60 degrees, I hate it. So that kind of limits where you want to be. For example, this summer I was on a trip to England, to London, and a couple of other places for 10 days, and it was to celebrate the Queen's 60th anniversary of the coronation. So this was called a royal trip, so we went to a garden party at Buckingham Palace. Here was my experience at the garden party. London was having a heat wave. It was 97 degrees, and the British were still saying, "Oh, this is so nice after that terrible spring we've had." So I stood there, kind of dressed properly for once, and I was sweating bullets. And I looked like the woman who was going to have the stroke. And so I was using some pieces of paper to fan myself, and I'm walking through the garden, not noticing anything except for where is a chair. So I walked toward this huge oak tree that had a bench surrounding it, and there were people sitting along this bench. And I went and I stood right in front of a young man who was reading a newspaper. And I just stood there, and I think I sweated on him a little. He lifted his head, saw me, and thought he didn't want to be responsible for picking me up, so he vacated. So, my experience with hot weather is not great. So I do more Arctic, or I love the Falklands. I would live there. I'd go back there in a heartbeat. It is more British than Britain. It's like going into 1950s Great Britain. They fly the flag and they drink tea and they drink pints at the pub and they love it all. So.
How many people live there?
There are 3,000 people who live in the Falklands, and in Stanley, which is their capital city, there are about 2,000 people. So there are 700 islands that make up the archipelago, but probably 15 of them are occupied. And people are really spread out. And there's no real boat culture there, so they get back and forth by that little airplane that I showed the slide of. They take it like if they need to go to Stanley to do paperwork. They'll hop on the plane. Yeah.
The customs guy, do that many ships come and go to where are they going?
All right, where are the ships going when they come into the Falklands? Because I mentioned the customs guy. They have a lot of trade that comes in and out of the Falklands. The Falklands has a lot of sheep, as I mentioned, the ones that were following me everywhere. And that they used to export more sheep than almost any other place on the planet at one point. And then when people started not to eat so much mutton, in Britain started to not liking as much mutton, they had to figure out how to specialize their sheep experience there. So they still deal with a lot of sheep, and they import everything, pretty much everything, and that's why those ships are there. Yes?
Do they make a lot of wool sweaters and such like they do in Scotland, for instance, with the sheep wool?
In the Falklands, do they make a lot of wool sweater or wool knitted products like in Scotland? I didn't see many. They could be doing that, but I really didn't see it. These are really hardworking people. There's a large base there, military base there, that is not counted in the population count. And there are about 1,500 soldiers that are there that are British soldiers. In fact, Prince William was there, and he left the day before I got there. So I got to hear about his last night in town, and where he went to a bar, and he was surrounded. He's got these bodyguards, and so they closed down the pub, but they let everyone who was in the pub stay in the pub. And so so there's a big military presence on the island. You don't really see it. And I don't think those guys are knitting much. Maybe not. So, yes.
When you're working on a story, do you travel alone, and does the pressure of needing to produce an article reduce your pleasure of the trip?
When I'm working on a story, and I'm traveling alone, does the pressure of working on a story diminish my pleasure of the trip, is the question. I travel alone a lot, and in fact now, because I've been travel writing quite a bit, every place I go is fodder for a story. So I think everywhere I go, I just view it the same way, only I'm going to do a show and tell. I take these little notebooks, and every night when I'm on a trip, I sit down. It doesn't matter what condition I'm in at night. I will sit down and I will write in the notebook, or I might wait till the next morning. But I record everything I saw. I really do. I've learned over the years that you can pre-write a story just by looking in your notebooks and reading some of the, they turn into little essays. So I love doing that. It really makes me more observant and looking at everything. Also, I know you think I have a big schmancy, fancy camera, but it's a little point and shoot made by Sony. And I've learned how to be really good with a grab shot. And that takes as much time as sitting and, thinking about writing a story. I often use the camera as a way to record my impressions of a place. And my kids make fun of me because apparently I look pretty funny when I take these pictures, so I'm going to start having to pay attention to that a little bit more. Yes?
You mentioned about the travel conference that you've gone to. Is that something that they do every year, or are there others that are around the area?
I mentioned a travel conference during my talk. At that point, and this man wants to know if there are other travel writing conferences around. The travel writing conference I went to then was called Troutbeck. It's now morphed into Travel Classics Travel Writing Conference. And they hold a couple of those a year, one in some exotic foreign place, and another one in the US. And they kind of split between East Coast and West Coast. And that's the only one I've been to. And it has 30 to 35 writers and 15 editors. So I love it. And as I said during the talk, it was a fluke that I got in. But, once you get in, you make friends with people. And, especially the conference organizer. And so she lets me back. But I highly recommend going to conferences, any kind of writing conferences, if you're interested in writing, because honestly, 3/4 of this business is about who you know. So meeting those editors face to face is huge. People should travel to New York and just talk to editors if they can. There are great writers everywhere, but the ones who get published are the ones who are persistent and really work on their networking. Anyone else? Yes?
What's your dream trip?
Oh, the dream trip, it came back. What is my dream trip? One thing I've always wanted to do, and although my family's in the room, they should plug their ears about this one, because I think it would be very neat, and I've thought of this as a story idea, to actually take a trip around the world without touching ground, and not using planes. So basically being in a boat all the time. That is my dream trip. I love being in a boat. I've never been in a big boat, like on a cruise boat. I think the biggest one I was on held 150 people. So I would do all forms of boat travel all around the world. Yes?
Have there been any places you've been that you would never want to go back to?
Have there been any places I've been that I would never want to go back to? Not really. I think I can usually find, if it's not, I tend to go to places and get kind of fancy treatment because I'm a travel writer, and people start thinking, oh, if we treat her really well and like give her 1,200 count thread sheets, well, she will really like this place. But that's really, as you can see, it's lost on me. I'm not that kind of writer, so any place I can go where I can just be outside and I can find something interesting. So I have not met a place that's done me in yet. Except those darn skuas. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, in the back. Good question. What made me decide to focus on birds in my travel writing? When I was at that conference and I was surrounded by these very accomplished writers, and I'd done nothing to that at that point, I saw that they were kind of branding themselves, and some of them were saying, I write about adventure travel, I do soft adventure, I do luxury. Everyone had their shtick. So I found the most unlikely shtick, and it was, I just said, I often write about birds and traveling to see birds. I don't think I'd ever done that yet, but that's what I said, and people didn't forget it. And I remember going in for a meeting with an editor from Travel and Leisure, and I opened by saying, I often write about birds and traveling to see birds. And she said, oh, I hate birds. I'd never run an article with birds in them. So we had nothing to talk about after that. So it can kind of cut both ways. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'll sign books.